Hello, I'm Dr. Jennifer Henry, a proud alum of the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Melbourne. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today. Critical research work is undertaken in the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences to support the advancement of societal, animal and environmental well-being, and none more so than the need to assist our agriculture industry to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere through the production of the foods we buy, and adapt to the changing climate conditions we're facing each year. I'm delighted to be joining two leading researchers from the faculty for this important discussion about the proactive measures the agriculture industry is taking to work towards net zero emissions and adapt to our changing climate, as well as exploring what could be possible with the additional support from the science community and further investment, and learn about how we as food consumers can help. Sharing their expert insights with us today, we have Professor Richard Eckard, who is Professor of Sustainable Agriculture and Director of the Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, which is a research centre addressing the impacts of a changing climate on agriculture. Richard's research focuses on sustainable agricultural production, with a recent focus on carbon neutral agriculture and options for agriculture to respond to a changing climate. Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. Good to be here.
Dr. Rachel Carey is a lecturer in food systems in the School of Agriculture and Food, where her teaching and research focuses particularly on the governance of resilient and sustainable food systems. Rachel also leads the Foodprint Melbourne project, which is investigating the resilience of Melbourne's food systems to shocks and stresses, and the role of Melbourne's food bowl in increasing the resilience of the city's food supply. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
Thank you both for your time today. Richard, my first question is for you. The Australian agricultural industry is being extremely proactive in working towards mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. Can you tell us about some of the initiatives and the effects these have been having?
Look, the Paris Climate Agreement set us on a course towards a world of climate neutral by 2050, net zero by 2050. And all industries have been responding. And we've seen the multinational food supply companies all set targets towards carbon neutrality. So it's inevitable that Australian agriculture, where 70% is exported, we need to show that we are on the track towards carbon neutrality. So we've seen the National Farmers Federation, we've seen the various industries all come out and say we are aiming for carbon neutral production by 2050. Some have set more ambitious targets, like Meat and Livestock Australia has set a target for the red meat industry to be carbon neutral by 2030. Very ambitious target. So there's significant investment going into what are the strategies to reduce methane from livestock, what are the opportunities to reduce nitrous oxide from soils and fertilisers, what's the opportunity to store carbon in the landscape, either in soil or trees.
We're starting to hear more and more about regenerative and resilient agricultural practices and their importance in contributing towards sustainable food systems and adapting to changing climate conditions. Richard, can you share a few examples of how this may be working in the Australian agricultural industry?
Yeah, regenerative agriculture is ringing true with the next generation of farmers coming through. We've used terms like sustainability for 40 years, and I think it started losing its meaning. And regenerative comes through with this notion that we're going to leave it better than we found it, rather than just leave it like we found it. And so it's ringing true with another generation of farmers. And one of the big challenges in Australia in a changing climate is being able to bridge greater climate variability, bigger intervals between extreme rainfall events, for example. And just having better soil health, as an example, better soil organic matter, allows better water holding capacity in the soil, which means you can bridge the gap between rainfall events better with soils that are treated more regeneratively than soils that are more extractive or lower in their soil organic matter. Just one example.
Rachel, can you tell us how the local agricultural industry in and around Melbourne is adapting to build more resilient farm systems?
Look, I think the farmers are certainly already adapting to a changing climate. They're having to adapt, and they're adapting in a number of different ways. So certainly one of the things that we're seeing quite a lot of at the moment is farmers taking up recycled water to adapt to a warming and a drying climate. We're lucky on the fringe of Melbourne in that obviously we have the city's 2 main water treatment plants that produce lots of recycled water. And so that's one way that farmers are adapting to these sorts of changing conditions. Farmers are adapting in other ways too, though. So they're adapting to become less dependent on fossil fuels. So we're seeing livestock farmers, doing things like taking the animal waste that's produced on farm and using it to produce energy to fuel the farm's energy needs. And we're seeing farmers also adapt to be more resilient to COVID-19 conditions in addition to climate change. And these things are, of course, all related now because we have both types of these circumstances going on at the moment. And so we're seeing farmers adapt to that, not just on farm, but in their supply chains as well, having to pivot as they're losing markets. So when the hospitality sector closed down, for instance, and restaurants and cafes closed, and farmers had to innovate very quickly. Many farmers went online, took their businesses online, changed that way. So I think we're really seeing farmers needing to adapt very quickly to the changing circumstances, using a diverse range of production approaches. And I think that's a key thing about more resilient production systems also, is that they are diverse. So farmers are really adapting to whatever particular changing conditions they find.
That's one of the key principles of adaptation. Where you've got more variable climates, you need diversified income. So we're seeing, instead of monocultures, instead of wheat on wheat, we start to see farmers go back into livestock combinations with wheat as a more resilient agricultural system. But what Rachel was talking about around renewable energy on farm has become quite popular. So solar generation, biofuels as an option, wind generation. This is also a form of diversified income for a farmer that is more consistent. You can imagine solar and wind is more consistent as an income stream than if you are experiencing droughts, for example. So diversification is part of adaptation in agriculture, and renewable energy is an option.
Just picking up actually on what Richard said there in terms of farmers who are actually diversifying their production techniques. One thing we're also seeing on the fringe of Melbourne is farmers moving into more protected and enclosed cropping systems. That might be large greenhouses on the city fringe, for instance, where they're actually controlling the temperature and controlling for those climate extremes by starting to produce in enclosed systems. And the benefits of those also are that they can apply really precise amounts of water and nutrients in those systems. Sometimes they're soilless systems. They're often used for high-value vegetable production, as an example. But that's something that I think that we're seeing more of, particularly on the fringe of Melbourne.
So are these adaptations being picked up by farmers individually, or are they being led by industry groups such as the VFF?
I think the cropping groups, for example, are playing a strong role. So Bircher Cropping Group, as an example, Southern Farming Systems, are picking up on this trend from the one I mentioned earlier about wheat on wheat became the most profitable outcome, but we started seeing less and less successes in 10. So, 40 years ago, you might get 8 successful crops in 10, and now we're getting 3 or 4. So that system has to change, not the least of which is the gradual reduction in soil organic matter as a result. And so part of the adaptation is bringing in rotations with legume crops, for example, so to restore the nitrogen balance, bring back the organic matter, but also to bring livestock in because you've got more of a closed nutrient loop, that you can start feeding a crop residue with livestock as part of a diversified system, but also more resilient, because in a good year you get a good price out of the wheat crop. In a bad year, the wheat crop might fail, but actually the micron of the wool is more valuable in a dry year. So having wheat and sheep, for example, is quite a strong adaptation in climate future.
Richard, we're hearing some general terminology around carbon neutrality. However, the opposite's actually the best case in agriculture. Help me to understand why that is.
The term carbon neutrality comes from the fossil fuel sector, where carbon is the problem, so carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. So we've applied that across all sectors without really thinking it through. What we actually want in the fossil fuel and transport sector is no CO2 emissions, no carbon emissions. In agriculture, we actually want more carbon. We want more carbon in our soils. We want more carbon in our trees. If you think of all living vegetation, 46% of all living vegetation is carbon. So actually, most farmers are in the business of carbon farming, whether they know that or not. So in agriculture, a healthy ecosystem, a healthy soil, a healthy landscape has more carbon in it, not less.
Rachel, how does research and policy making play a part in the Melbourne region in working towards a sustainable agricultural industry?
I think both of those two things are really important. I think research has a very important role and is playing a very important role in the Melbourne region, but also beyond, in really providing an evidence base to understand how what types of practices we ought to be moving towards and how farmers can actually move towards those practices. And certainly that's something that we're doing on the Foodprint Melbourne project that I've been leading over the last 5 years. We've been working very much with farmers and with government, with state and local government as well, to understand where the gaps are in the evidence base and how we can assist to fill those gaps, and also really work with them in a very engaged way where they're helping to shape the very research questions that we ask and helping us to understand the implications of the findings that are emerging for their practice too. So certainly the research is absolutely critical. Policy, also absolutely critical, really. There's some interesting initiatives that are taking place at the moment around the Melbourne region. So one key issue is how can we incentivise farmers to move towards more sustainable practices, and how can we reward farmers that are moving in that direction. And we're seeing some local governments introducing quite interesting policies, for instance, where they are offering farmers discounts on their rates if they're moving towards more sustainable farming practices. And there's various ways that we could think about how can we extend those sorts of policies to really incentivise a significant transition towards these more sustainable farming practices.
We're finding in this whole area of climate change, the interaction between research and policy is quite critical, because policy needs to know and have the confidence it's building on sound research, that evidence-based, as Rachel was saying. So policy can't build an offset method, for example, a carbon offset method, unless they've got solid science sitting behind, quantifying exactly what this will achieve. But at the same time, farmers actually rely on us for the evidence base. So you take this move towards regenerative agriculture, and one of the things that we haven't done well and will be doing more in the future is moving into more providing the evidence base for farmers of what are the actual benefits of moving into more regenerative practices. Can we quantify the improvement in soil health and the long-term benefits? Because sometimes it's not just the year-on-year benefit, you make more money in this year. Maybe it's more in a variable climate. It's a decadal time step that you're looking at, that you have more consistent production through. And that's actually the evidence that we need to produce.
So how can researchers be part of the solution to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, or indeed assist in working towards reducing these emissions entirely?
The research field is quite wide open still in this area. There's lots of opportunities to engage. The options to reduce methane from livestock are not just one or two. There's probably, I've reviewed probably 20 different strategies at the moment that are out there for reducing, focusing on animal management of systems, focusing on the animal's diet itself, and then focusing inside the animal on processes inside the animal. And all of those have some merit into the future. The same with nitrous oxide emissions. There's not just one option to reduce those in agriculture. Same with options to improve soil organic matter and store carbon in the landscape. So there's a whole range of solutions, from very basic research required through to full farm implementation and applied-based research to give farmers the confidence to adopt.
Rachel, the Victorian government released a circular economy policy early last year. What might a circular economy look like in the agriculture industry in and around Melbourne?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess from the food point of view, we're really thinking about circular food economies and how they can build on circular food system principles. And the idea there is that we think about any waste that's coming out of the farming system, but also coming out of the whole food supply chain as resources. And how can we extract the most value from those resources? And how can we then create new industries and create new products from those resources? So it really requires us to think very differently about the sorts of waste products that are being generated. Now, one of the things that's really important, I think Richard touched on this earlier in terms of food systems, is we want to think about this from a circular point of view. There are really valuable nutrients in the food system, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, and we want to manage to keep those elements, those really important nutrients, in the food system. So how can we do that? How can we take the nutrients from our food waste, for instance, and ensure that they go back into the food system by processing that waste and ensuring that it ends up back on farm, perhaps as compost or as a biofertilizer. Now, where that feeds into cities is that, of course, when we think about circular food systems, we want to think about what scale are we going to do that at? And of course, a local scale is a really good practical scale to be working at. So things like compost, we don't want to transport them too far, they're very heavy. Also, we need to think about wastewater from that point of view too. Wastewater is an incredibly valuable resource in a warming and drying climate. It could be one of the most secure sources of water that we have in future from that point of view for farming. And so how can we recycle the water that's in the main city water treatment plants? We have huge volumes of wastewater. How can we recycle that for use on farm? And how can we extract the valuable nutrients that are actually in that wastewater? So really circular food economies at a city scale is something that just fits because, of course, cities are really concentrated sources of waste, food waste, organic waste, wastewater. And it's really important that we start to think about this much more in future, how to build these circular food economies, because the natural resources that underpin things like conventional fertilizer, of course, all declining in supply. We need to keep those fossil fuels in the ground now that underpin conventional fertilizers, and we've really got to think about how to extract the most value that we can from water as well. So I think it's a really interesting and very important policy direction. Lots more work to do there.
No, I think there's the same out on the farm that we need to start thinking about, because the demands on, say, organic matter recycling are increasing. So, there's biofuels. Well, do we use that wheat straw for biofuels? Do we use that wheat straw for second generation ethanol is an option? Or do we just simply have to put it back in the soil because that's the best use of that resource? Another one, for example, is do you transport that to a centralized location to generate biochar as a new product and a source of energy? Are you transporting it and spending more diesel emissions, transporting it to a central location in the hope you're going to save emissions? Or if you have an oil seed that is a byproduct, do you transport cottonseed oil from Narrabri down to Gippsland to feed to dairy cows to reduce methane? Have you spent more diesel transporting it down to Gippsland than you're going to save in methane? And these are all researchable questions, particularly in discrete little, modelling studies, systems analysis type studies that our students are taking on.
I think that Richard's absolutely right. There are lots of trade-offs, and I think the really important point that Richard's made there is that we've got to think about the big picture when we're thinking about these things, all sorts of trade-offs. So if we're talking about animal waste that's produced on farm, is the best use to be taking that animal waste and using it to produce energy that perhaps is used back on farm, or do we need to capture the nutrients from that animal waste and ensure that they go back into the food system so we're not losing them through creating that energy? So there's lots of trade-offs here, and I think thinking about that in terms of circular food system principles and how we can keep those nutrients in the system is a really important part of that.
A good example that might be a dairy, where you've got a centralised waste system from the dairy, which is the effluent from the animals. Historically, farmers were good at spreading that back on paddocks, probably not the whole farm, but so more concentrated, as long as the effluent pipe can stretch, usually, is where it goes back. But the question Rachel has posed is, well, there's a lot of organic matter in there that is just going off as methane. Can we generate methane? Because a dairy itself is a very high energy user. So can we, and it needs a lot of heating and cooling, and you've got methane sitting there as a potential source. So, is the future that we have all those effluent systems capped? What that effectively does is generate methane from the organic material that displaces the energy in the dairy, but it concentrates the nutrients, so you're not transporting as many nutrients in as much water as you used to back out to the paddocks. You've got a more concentrated fertilizer. So those are the systems of the future. We think that sort of closed loop nutrient cycle.
Richard, there's been a great deal of conversation politically around the goal of net zero emissions in agriculture. Do you think that this goal is enough, or should we in fact be aiming for reduced emissions?
There's been some fairly high profile papers recently and climate scientists challenging the concept of net zero, because what net zero says is it gives you a kind of license to say, well, as long as we can store carbon in the soils or the trees, we can continue emitting our greenhouse gases, because net zero is where we want to get to. I suspect that will be challenged in the next few years, that methane is fundamentally different to nitrous oxide, which is fundamentally different to CO2 in the atmosphere. So you can't just offset it all by putting it in carbon in soil. So we will move beyond sequestration as an option to offset our emissions. The other obvious problem with sequestration relying on offsets is that you get to saturation. We did a great carbon neutral audit on a farm out at Hamilton that had planted 22% of the farm down to trees, and they were carbon neutral between 2010 and 2017. Then the trees grew up and they stopped accumulating more carbon, but the methane continued. And so you can see you run out of space to plant trees to offset all the emissions, especially if the industrial sector also want agriculture's offsets. We run out of space. Soils, you cannot store carbon indefinitely in soils. They will get to a new saturation, a new steady state. So the notion of just offsetting our emissions is just buying us time to deal with the real issue, which is we need to reduce methane and nitrous oxide emissions.
So how can the business community become more involved in mitigating or reducing greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture, or increase their involvement?
We've actually seen the business sector get very involved, actually. Since the Paris Agreement, we've seen Unilever, for example, set emission reduction targets for that match the Paris Agreement. Well, Fonterra, one of the biggest dairy suppliers in the world, is the major dairy supplier to Unilever. So if Fonterra want to continue supplying Unilever, they've got to get on board with the same targets. So Fonterra's now set those targets. Suddenly all the dairy farmers in New Zealand are aware that their supply chain is demanding low emissions production. And so you can see that drive down the supply chain, and I could quote many others, Nestle, the most recent one is Heineken, looking for carbon neutral barley malt supply out of Australia. And so you can see how the business sector is getting involved. Through setting targets for the supply chain, they're starting to set targets that'll flow all the way through to farmers needing new practices on farm to produce low emissions products.
Rachel, how can local farmers around Melbourne be supported to build their resilience in adapting to changing climate conditions?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because I think farmers definitely need a lot of help to do this. And I think that it's really important that government also steps in to help support, to lead in that process. Now, a first step might be to simply, for government to be bringing together farmers, industry, other stakeholders to say, what's our vision for this? What's our vision for transitioning to more sustainable farming practices, and also to be adapting to climate change and other shocks and stresses so we become more resilient overall. So I think that kind of role of brokering that sort of vision is a really important first step. And, there's other kind of policy implementation, I guess, that we would like to see from that point of view. I think there's some really important things that that government could be doing there to support farmers. And I think, again, it gets back to what we discussed before, which is all about incentivizing and rewarding that kind of transition. And there are ways that we can do that, particularly through extension services, through training. Farmers really need a lot of support, and unfortunately, on the fringe of Melbourne, farmers haven't had as much support because it tends to go out to regional areas. They're often excluded from the funding and training programs, and it's really important that sort of those sorts of services are actually provided to farmers on the fringe. So I think it's really about government saying, how can we support farmers in this process and working with, and also then, of course, about researchers, the university sector coming in to actually support that process as well.
We're all food consumers, so how can we help build resilience in food production systems through our dietary choices?
I think one of the things that's important there, of course, is to be thinking about how we can rebuild local and regional food supply chains. So obviously, from a resilient food system point of view, it's really important that we are sourcing food from a diverse range of sources. So local, obviously also national and global as well. But we've neglected our local and our regional food supply chains and focused more, I think, in recent years on our national and global food supply chains. I think COVID-19 has shown us that those supply chains can be quite vulnerable, and it's really important to also rebuild local and regional food supply chains. So what can we do as consumers about that? Well, we can obviously support our local farmers first up. So we can be trying to buy direct from local farmers wherever we possibly can, to ensure they get a greater share of our food dollar. There's different ways that we can do that, whether that be buying from farmers at the farm gate, farmers markets, through box schemes, buying from online. Many more farmers are online than used to be. So really ensuring that they're able to make a viable living is a really important part of that. And I think we're going to have to ask ourselves some important questions if we want the food system to be more resilient, which is partly around how we ensure that everybody is paid fairly through the food system, starting with farmers, but not only farmers. And I think, again, COVID-19 has really shone a spotlight on this, on the issues with fair pay through the food supply chain. We've had, of course, we've had the situation where food prices have been really pushed down quite low over the last few years, where if you were to look back to, say, the Second World War, we probably would have found that people in Australia would have spent, let's say, a third of their income on food. Now it's probably more like 10% of our income is spent on food. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, well, what is a fair price to pay for food if we really want to have a more resilient food system in the future, on farm, but right through the whole food supply chain? Then I think we need to start to think about how to pay fairly for our food and what an appropriate price is. Really to ensure that resilience through the supply chain. It really starts with paying people and farmers fairly.
I could probably add to your diet choice. We get that question a lot, particularly from students in our lectures. There's always a question in all of my climate change lectures about diet choice as part of the solution. And there's no doubt that diet moderation, eating less red meat in your diet right now, can reduce your personal greenhouse gas footprint. There's a bigger question, does that make a global difference? And to what extent that can make a global difference? Because you could make an argument that if you're in a subsistence existence in East Africa, for example, where I do a fair bit of work in Kenya on these issues, you could argue that to be vegetarian in a village in East Africa, you need livestock. So it's not that simple. It's not a simple question about diet choice. Only about 15% of the world's population actually get a choice about what they eat in the first place. So it's only really a province of the wealthy to decide what you eat. If you're in that village in East Africa, you need livestock to plough the field. Otherwise, you'd have to go and buy a diesel tractor and emit diesel emissions. So they plough the field for you. That same animal gets corralled at night and the nutrients get collected in the corral system, and that's the nutrients that go onto the cropping field. And so in order to grow crops, you need the livestock. And they're not just a source of meat. In fact, they're invariably not a source of meat. They're actually a source of milk, draft power, and a symbol of wealth, a symbol of recycling nutrients. And some of those systems, if you allocate the greenhouse gas emissions in those systems to the multifunctionality of the system and the closed-loop nutrient nature of those systems, they're actually pretty efficient. So diet choice is really a question of, I think it comes back to, there's no doubt that as we individually become more wealthy, we demand more animal-based protein in our diets. There's a great graphs that show this trend. And so you've got countries like the United States, Australia, UK sitting up on the right-hand side of that continuum, and a lot of people aspiring to have more animal-based protein in their diet. I think that's very instructive, because why are people wanting more animal-based protein in their diet as they become more affluent? Because it's a perception of an affluent diet. And if we on the top right of that graph can change what the perception of an affluent diet is to be more moderate in consumption patterns, then perhaps we can reset the expectations of people as they become more wealthy to have a more moderated diet.
Who's in the best position to lead a perception change?
Yeah, it's us as a society. It's those in the developed world that need to accept that we have a role, not necessarily that making our diet change will make a global difference in the short term, because it'll change our personal greenhouse gas footprint. But in the long term, if it's a societal expectation we all head for low emissions consumption patterns in the future, then that will change the aspirations of those coming into that rising middle class of the world, who will then aspire to a more moderate diet that is perceived to be an affluent diet.
So you say we as a society, it could be policymakers, government-driven, Instagram influencers. You just need Gwyneth Paltrow to say, eat less meat, and we're done?
Well, it might not be eating less meat per se, because what if research in the next year comes up, we already know that methane can be reduced by 80%. It might be where you source your food from in the future. So you're looking for those low emission farming systems to source food. And so we're actually rewarding those farmers that are aiming down the low emissions track. Whether it's livestock or not, right now it makes a difference, but in 10 years' time, I suspect it's not going to make as much of a difference as it used to.
I think for me, there's a sort of bigger picture question here, I suppose, about how do we keep the food system within planetary boundaries. Overall, we've got a few different options for doing that. I guess one is to change the way that we produce food, and obviously Richard's been talking about that. We've been talking about that here today. One is to simply waste less food than we're wasting. Of course, we're wasting at least probably a third of what's produced, and if we wasted less food, then we'd have to actually produce less food, and we put less pressure on the food system overall. And then, of course, the third way is to change the way that we're eating, so to change our dietary patterns. I think there's definitely some evidence out there at the moment that perhaps we need to do all three, so bring the food system back within planetary boundaries, that if we're just working on one or two of those areas, we're probably not likely to be able to go all the way and really bring the food system back to where we need it to be. But perhaps there's also an issue here about thinking about how we consume meat more fairly across the world. So, for instance, Richard's already talked about people's incomes rising in various parts of the world, and meat is obviously being eaten more as people's incomes rise. And it's really important that in those parts of the world where diets have been less diverse, that they're able to do that, but do that in such a way that as they're eating more meat in various parts of the world, we're not completely blowing out those greenhouse gas emissions. And perhaps one way of doing that is that for those of us in the rich parts of the world who've been eating a lot more meat for a long time, and probably actually a lot more than we need to be eating, that we can think about reducing our meat consumption so that people elsewhere in the world can be increasing their meat consumption and eating more diverse diets and getting the nutrient benefits that, as Richard said, are actually quite important, or can be quite important from meat. So I think it's about thinking about still how we eat meat and what way do we do that in future. And, there's definitely things that we could be doing to perhaps change the way that we think about eating meat here. And I guess one important way just might be for governments to be introducing sustainable dietary guidelines that tell us all how to eat in a way that might bring the food system back within planetary boundaries, as well as how we can eat healthily.
Richard, how else can our consumer preferences help reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
I think the fact that multinational food companies and supply chains are setting greenhouse gas emissions targets, one would argue, are they just meeting shareholder demand? Well, why are they changing that? Well, because they're perceiving that we as the consumer are changing our preferences. And I think that's quite empowering, because what it actually says is these multinational companies like Unilever are responding to where they think the future consumer is wanting to go. And so if we start preferentially sourcing more moderated diets, diets that are maybe lower emissions based, the supply chain is going to respond to that, because they've got shareholders that might not necessarily care about the emissions, but they care about the dollars. And so I find that quite empowering in some way, that our consumer choices are starting to have an influence and can have an influence.
So, Richard, looking forward, what areas of research do you believe could lead to the next round of breakthroughs in reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
A lot of the solutions around being explored right now around reducing emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture are chemical interventions. Can we feed an inhibitor to reduce methane? Can we put a vaccine in? And these are good developments. But long term, if we're looking for sustainable solutions, we need to move away from those interventions to something that is perpetual, inheritable, repeatable. So, for example, if instead of coating our fertilizer with nitrification inhibitors that can reduce the nitrous oxide from them, we should look at legume agriculture. In other words, using more natural biological nitrogen fixation to enhance the nitrogen cycle in agricultural systems. So take more of that could lead to greater soil organic matter as a result of the legume, leads to less dependence on fossil fuel fertilizers. But a lot of legumes in the animal supply chain have secondary compounds that reduce methane. So there's sort of three actions in one option there. The ultimate endpoint for livestock methane, for example, yes, we've got options coming through now that inhibitors that can reduce methane by more than 80%, but they have to be fed daily in order to have the effect. Yeah, so there's interesting research emerging now, a very high-profile paper in the Science Journal, which suggests you can raise animals on a low profile of methane, so those are methanogens in their stomach, that then perpetuates later into life. This is linked to the science we've known for a long time that your and my gut microflora are a product of our upbringing, of our environment. It turns out it's the same in ruminants, that actually you can train them through multiple generations to be low methane producing. And it's called early life programming, where you can actually train them in their early life to have a low profile of methane, and it seems to perpetuate through life. You think long-term in sustainable agriculture, that has to be where we want to land, not having to intervene with chemicals all the time and ask farmers to pay for inhibitor products on a daily basis, but they just have animals that are low methane and that perpetuate through generations.
Rachel, what do you feel should be the next priority in developing a circular food economy in the Melbourne region?
I think there's a few different priorities actually that we probably want to think about. The first thing is just to actually map the nutrient flows around the region, around Melbourne City region and into the state more broadly. So if we think about a circular food system, we have areas, we have hotspots where nutrients are being produced around the city, and they can be things like waste facilities, where you have large amounts of nutrients being produced. It can be in the water treatment facilities, for instance. And of course, we have nutrients being produced out on farm and city region, particularly things like animal waste, for instance, or various crop residues. And then we need to think about who actually needs those resources, what industries, what other products might need those resources that are being produced as well. So who's producing the nutrients, who actually needs them? We need to start to map those flows of nutrients, and we need to start also to be linking or coordinating, I guess, the different stakeholders that actually produce and could use the nutrients. That's the first thing. I think also just to be developing a vision, a collaborative vision for a circular food economy in the region that all stakeholders can buy into. So we all know what direction it is that we want to be heading in. And then I think there's some consumer behaviour changes that are probably actually quite important as well. So for instance, if we want farmers to be using compost, biofertiliser products, etc. on farm, we need to make sure that those compost products aren't contaminated with things like glass and plastics, etc. Farmers need to be confident in the product. And that means that when we're all putting our food waste into the green bin, because many of us have that facility now, and those that don't will have it in future, when we're putting the food waste into the green bin, we need to make sure that we're doing that in an appropriate way. So we're developing high quality compost products that can be used on farm. And then I think also working with farmers to understand how we can take these products from a circular food economy and really tailor them so they absolutely meet their needs. I think one of the problems at the moment sometimes is that conventional fertilizers in some circumstances are actually doing a better job than some of these organic compost products, and are sometimes cheaper as well. So how can we work with farmers to be developing products that really meet their needs for particular crops and particular types of circumstances? So I think there's a fair bit of work to be done there, and that's really a collaborative visioning and research exercise.
Richard and Rachel, thank you so much for your insights from both the national perspective and the localised approach in Melbourne. Thank you.